Okay. So I think I shall start. So welcome everyone to this final NILE Insights session, teaching subject content through English. My name is Jason Skeet. I'm going to be the chair for the discussion. I work for NILE. I'm the program leader for NILE's MA in Professional Development for Language Education. I'm also a consultant and trainer, and I deliver training in CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning. I also deliver training in EMI, English as the medium of instruction. I'm sure these are terms that will come up in the discussion. So let me just very quickly show you some slides that I need to just quickly talk through. Just to let you know that the session is being recorded. Please make sure you don't share any personal information in the chat, so don't put your personal emails in the chat, for example. You should also, if you can do this, by going to the video settings in the bottom left-hand corner, and it would be really good if you could click the box there that says hide non-video participants. That will mean you can only see the panelists and me as the chair, of course. So if you could do that, if you go to the video settings, bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Just to let you know that this Insight event, we've been doing these throughout the summer, and they are to mark our 25th anniversary, NILE's 25th birthday. So that's why we're doing these. And if you want to get the recording later, if you want to relive the experience, you can do so from NILE's membership page. It's free to become a member. There's other resources there that you can find. So I would recommend that you become a member, and you can also then access the recording of this Insight session. And also just to let you know that at the end of the session, you'll be able to download a certificate. I will remind you again at the end of that. So I'm just now going to stop sharing the screen, because what I want to do now is introduce the three panelists. And I'm going to do this in alphabetical order, I think. So first of all, let me introduce Phil Ball. Phil works mainly for the Federation of Basque Schools, and he's based in San Sebastian in Spain. He's a CLIL materials writer and teacher trainer. He's been involved in several European-based CLIL projects. He's written a wide variety of CLIL-based textbooks for the Basque and Spanish social science and English language programs. He also co-designed the CLIL Essentials online course for the British Council, and he's the module leader for our NILE MA CLIL module. He's also the co-author of a book called Putting CLIL into Practice, which is highly recommended. And he's also produced a series of textbooks which in 2016 were nominated for the Elton's Innovation Award. So hello, Phil. Are you there, Phil? Oh, he's muted himself, so I'm sure he'll say hello later. Let me go to Rosie then. So our second panelist is Rosie Tanner. Rosie is a British freelance consultant based in the Netherlands. She's a consultant in CLIL, in coaching, including video coaching and English language teaching. She's also previously worked at 3 different universities in the Netherlands. In fact, we used to work together at Utrecht University, and everything I know about CLIL, I've learned from Rosie Tanner. She's also worked in many countries and contexts with teachers, trainers, managers. Some of the countries she's worked in include China, India, Japan, Kazakhstan, the Netherlands, of course, Poland and Spain. She has her own website, rosietanner.com, and one of the quotes that I like from her website is that she sees her work as being about making real connections with people, connecting in order to develop professionally in education. So I like that idea of connection. So hello, Rosie.
Hi, everybody.
And our third panelist then is John Wright. John is a freelance teacher, teacher trainer, consultant, examiner, and online MA tutor, including working for the NILE MA. and he has over 25 years of experience in ELT in the UK and abroad. He's currently based in Manchester, where he was a senior lecturer in TEFL at Manchester Metropolitan University. He's written over 17 ELT course books and resource books. He's particularly interested in innovative teaching methods, promoting learner autonomy, materials design, and CLIL. John also has extensive management experience, having started and managed a language school in the UK for 20 years, and he's a regular speaker at conferences and workshops in the UK and internationally. So welcome, John.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Okay, so the way this works is we've got some questions that we collected beforehand on a Padlet that was set up for that purpose. We've also asked each panelist to think of a question that they would like to pose for this discussion. And audience, you're also encouraged to put in questions into the chat. I'm going to do my best to multitask and keep an eye on the chat whilst keeping the panelists in order as well. So if you have a question that comes up, please put it into the chat. The first question then is actually from me, and it's to do with asking each panelist to provide us with just some examples of how teachers teach subject content through English. So examples from their own experience, perhaps particular places in the world where you've seen examples of teachers teaching subject content through English. And can I start with John for this?
Okay, sure. Thank you, Jason. So most recently, I've been doing quite a lot of work at university level, in particular with Italy and Germany. And the model there is less CLIL as we think of it, and more English as a medium for instruction. But one of the characteristics of university is the numbers. So I've done quite a lot of work with lecturers right through to professorial level, and they might be faced with a group of 150 or 200 undergraduate students, and they're teaching law or agriculture or whatever it might be through English to an increasingly international cohort of students. And they have some very specific challenges. So the numbers mean there's a huge problem with being sure of engagement of all the students, just managing the numbers and making sure that everyone is not just paying attention, but also benefiting from the input. So the work that I've been focusing on with those lecturers in particular has focused on active learning techniques in large group formations, which typically means departing from the traditional teacher-fronted lecture and using group work in various ways, and how you manage groups and how you get everyone involved as best you can in a very large environment like a university lecture hall. And that's proving quite a challenge, but it's an important one, and it's one that the university is obviously investing a lot of money into to help their staff attract international students, and the students are benefiting from because they want an international education increasingly. So I'm finding the overlap between CLIL and English as a medium of instruction at the higher levels is a very big area at the moment. So that's principally where I've been involved lately.
Okay, so your example is EMI in a higher education context. And one of the challenges there, of course, in lectures, you've got, lots of students. So how to make these lectures more active? Okay.
Yes.
Rosie, what's the example that you've got then?
Yes, I work totally different situation in the secondary schools in the Netherlands, and sometimes nowadays with vocational colleges. There are about 640 schools in the Netherlands. We're a small country, and 130 of them have 50% have to have a CLIL department, and they have 50% of their lessons in English, and this has been going on for maybe 20-25 years already.
Yeah.
So I work with biology teachers, history teachers, geography, art, and also there's a trend now in vocational teaching that hotel schools are teaching through English. So I've been learning to make a good cappuccino and to match salmon with fish and things like that. I also work in Kazakhstan, where actually it's a trilingual situation where students are learning Kazakh and Russian at secondary, and then later at the higher level of secondary they add English in, so that the idea is that the country becomes trilingual. I've also worked in Japan with teachers who have the students have very little English, the teachers' English is not so good, and so it's a matter of simplifying language very much and bringing a bit of content into the lessons, but quite a challenge.
And in that Kazakh context, am I right in saying that it's certain subjects that have been chosen for?
Yes,
mostly
English? Science, mostly science.
Yeah, okay.
Which is quite difficult because it's cognitively demanding.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Netherlands, in the lower vocational schools, they choose to teach art and PE and hands-on subjects.
Right, okay.
It's interesting to see which countries choose which subjects to teach through English.
Yeah, and we might come back to this issue about cognitive demand versus linguistic demand. We'll see how the discussion develops. Phil, what's your example that you'd like to share then?
Yeah, I've, like Rosie, I mean, I've been around a bit, as it were. I mean, I've seen a lot of different contexts, but I mean, perhaps it's best for me to talk about my most local context. I work in the Basque Country in the north of Spain, and the Basque Country is obviously an officially bilingual community anyway, and so the introduction of English there at the age of 4 in 1991 when I came here had a big impact on the introduction of CLIL, which they very bravely introduced right back then. I have worked in upper primary. I've done stuff in primary. I've worked at university level, but most of my work is at secondary level, like Rosie. And I think that my main contact with subject teachers has been social science. Social science was kind of fingered or identified as the subject which the Basques wanted to do wholly through English. And so very early on in this project that started back in 1991, when the kids got to the age of 14, they were doing social science until 16, the whole curriculum entirely through English, which was pretty radical in its day, and they're still doing that. The challenges are various. It's been pretty successful, I think, although I wouldn't wish to say 100%. But one obvious problem is that the social science curriculum has a lot of conceptual content. It has a lot of content to get through. And if you're studying the official curriculum through another language, you're obliged, of course, to cover the whole program. Parents will not accept it if you only do half the textbook. And obviously, CLIL, as we'll get onto, I suspect, a lot of CLIL methodology is very process-led, and so it takes longer to do CLIL successfully. It takes longer, and so it was a real challenge. It's been a real challenge, actually, to just cover the program. You know, I am without going into linguistic or cognitive, let's say, arguments. That's just a different thing to say, I think, from John and Rosie. But it's been very interesting.
Okay, so already, I mean, what you three of you have said, we've talked about primary, secondary, and higher education. We've talked about different subjects taught through English. So science subjects, social science, Phil, you mentioned. So in fact, when we talk about this idea of teaching subject content through English, we're talking about a wide range of different contexts, different practices as well. But if we focus for a moment on CLIL, because both Rosie and Phil, in fact, John, indeed, you talked about CLIL as well. Let's just focus then on this idea of CLIL. And Rosie, I think I want to go to you, and because I know that you've got a question that I think would be good to ask at this point. What is your question?
Okay, my question that I prepared in advance is, what are the qualities of a good CLIL teacher? And I'd like to ask John or Phil to answer first, and then I'll add my bit.
Okay. Phil, you fancy kicking that off then?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think I would have answered this spontaneously or prepared in the same way. I mean, we could go on for a long time here, beginning with what we think the qualities of a good teacher are generally, but that would take us far too long. And also, that strays into cultural areas. For me, it's very simple in CLIL. I think it's a good CLIL teacher is a teacher who is aware of the difference between methodology and transmission. And John talked about this or hinted at this earlier. What I mean is that the CLIL teacher becomes aware that they have to prioritize methodology and not prioritize transmission. There's nothing wrong with teacher talk. You know, it's been researched. It was researched by Mumby 30 years ago. You know, teacher talk is important, but too much teacher talk, too much transmission. In a CLIL class where you might have the learner operating through his or her third language is going to be, well, it might work. You might be a very good presenter and a very good speaker, a good transmitter. Nevertheless, it's not going to be, it's not going to work with maximum efficiency. So I'll just go back to what I said there. And I think, it relates to what John said, even about working with university teachers. You know, the teacher realizes that there's a difference between the methodology and the transmission, as it were. In other words, they go towards the methodology consideration and not the transmission one. And I mean, later we can talk about what we mean by, you know, those methodological parameters that are implicated in that decision.
Okay, so Phil, less of a focus on transmission, more of a focus on methodology. Would you add anything to that then, John?
Yes, I'd like to add to that a little bit. Often when I do CLIL training programs, the non-native speakers who I work with, they're worried that CLIL is all about being a fluent English speaker, which of course many of them are not. And in the early days, there was a lot of emphasis on that. And I would do a lot of training where the headmaster or the person in charge is just sent along the English teacher, thinking that the English teacher by magic would teach biology and history and everything else. So I don't want to talk about the language skills or the content knowledge, which are obvious, but I'd like to focus on a couple of other specifics. I think we know that teaching is a difficult job anyway. I think CLIL teaching is doubly difficult because you're taking more on board. So I would like to say that a good CLIL teacher is a motivator. You have to be someone who can motivate your students, however old they are, to do what seems impossible. So you're going to learn about photosynthesis, but guess what? You're going to do it in English. Now, learning about photosynthesis is difficult enough, but so a CLIL teacher has to make what seems impossible possible. So a can-do attitude is really important. And that doesn't come down to how well you speak English. A lot of the time, it's how well you can break down a topic into small chunks and make each one a small step, and you bring the whole class with you, those who are interested in the topic, those who are not so good at English, and they come along with you step by step so that the impossible becomes possible. So I really think motivating is a crucially important thing. And another aspect that's featured a lot in educational research lately is the importance of feedback, giving useful feedback about the language, about the task, about the group work, and about the content knowledge, so that the students are aware of their progress, and crucially, they're aware how to get better at each element of what's going on in the classroom. I think these are two very important skills which are often overlooked when people talk about good teaching. And I agree that they're aspects of good teaching anyway, but I think they're particularly important in the CLIL classroom.
Okay, so motivation, the ability to motivate learners, and then also feedback on learners' learning. Okay, and that's interesting that you're saying that you know, these are skills or attributes, qualities that are going to be important in any teaching context, but you're suggesting they're particularly important in CLIL. Is that something you would agree with then, Rosie?
Yes, I would definitely agree the importance of getting pupils to interact. I also don't think the level of English of the teacher is that important. I had a PE teacher in a group once and I thought, oh my goodness, his English isn't very brilliant. But when he was in the PE classroom, he got the kids working in English and he was fantastic. So classroom management is also maybe a good thing. PE teachers are good classroom managers anyway. I think also an ability to choose the right materials at the right level. It's difficult. Teachers tend to choose materials that are too difficult in terms of language. And certainly I'd also noted down feedback, the ability to give feedback and positive feedback and feedback to help learners to move on a little bit. So I agree with my other panel members.
Okay, that model of feedback of saying what went well and giving a target as a next step. Jeff Petty talks about medals and missions, and I always like that as a model of effective feedback. Okay, So were you happy with how that question was answered, Rosie?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Well, the next question, then I'm going to go to a question that we got on the Padlet. I'm going to read it out. I'm from Spain and we have some non-linguistic areas taught in English. The problem is that some of the students do not understand us. What do you think about teaching some part of the class in Spanish, in the L1? So this idea of teaching part of the class in the L1. What do we think about this? Can I start with you, Rosie? What's your response?
Yeah, I wasn't quite clear. I'm not quite clear about what the question means. Does it mean non-linguistic areas? Does that mean art or PE or something like that? And I can imagine, so. Yeah. And those are the subjects where emotions run higher, where kids are making something, a sculpture, or they're running around on the basketball field. So it's very difficult to keep them in the, that was pretty impossible really, to keep them in the L2. On the other hand, I'm against you giving the instructions in English and then immediately switching to the first language, because students get lazy and they just only listen to the instructions in that language that they understand best. So I would say maybe teach more of the cognitively challenging parts in Spanish, in Spanish, and then try and work out other parts of the class that you think the children will understand in English. And I think do things like establish routines, use the same instructions, have a poster on the wall with phrases that the students can learn and repeat. And I also thought, is there an English teacher around to help you prepare lessons or think about how to simplify language? I always think when I work with lower vocational education students here, teachers, I think it's much more difficult to simplify your instructions in 5 different ways so the students understand than it is going to a calc level. So I think it's also a skill to learn to simplify your language and yeah. But I can understand the difficulty, and it's very easy just to switch back into the same languages. You have the same language as the pupils, so it's easy. But you do want them to learn, so maybe just smaller goals for what you want them to learn through English. Okay. That's my bit.
Okay. Yeah. And Rosie, that term calc, of course, you're referring to more cognitive.
More academic language.
Academic. Okay. You didn't use the term translanguaging there.
I didn't.
No.
I was going to.
Phil can use translanguaging.
Phil, you use that then.
Okay. Well, I'd need a bit more information from the questioner. I'm not sure whether the questioner is saying that they don't understand him or her, or they don't understand the materials. I'm not quite sure. But maybe that's sort of immaterial. I think in general one would not wish to encourage the teacher to continue to stray from what's called the CLIL or the study language. If the questioner is in a bilingual project somewhere in Spain and the target language is English, or the study language is English, obviously you're trying to maximize that. But Jason's used the term translanguaging. I was thinking of mentioning this, and it's becoming quite a thing. And what it means is that if you are generally struggling, and again, I'm not quite sure of all the parameters of the struggle, but if you are struggling a little bit, then translanguaging means that what you can do is you try to work on a policy with your department, with the other teachers, about when and why and how you would introduce Spanish. Because what you don't want to be doing is what's called damage limitation. You know, if you just, well, let's do a bit in Spanish now, it's just damage limitation. You're not going to get anywhere doing that. You know, because the kids then will, of course, just think, well, you know, if I just sit for long enough, the teacher will go back to Spanish, and that's not going to work. And so translanguaging is rather saying something like, look, at the end of this lesson, I'm going to give you a homework task, and you're going to go home and you're going to read a text on the internet in Spanish. And then the next day we're going to come back and we're going to try and talk about it in English. And so you start using Spanish as a resource in some ways to try to help the students through this kind of fog of non-comprehension, if you like, because it can be very difficult and frustrating for the teacher and for the kids in these circumstances. You know? And so you do you sort of nod to Spanish, to the L1 in this case, Spanish, but you do it in a very careful way. You say, let's do this bit in Spanish, and you signal that it's going to come. you don't allow a kind of free-for-all. If you allow a free-for-all, then you might as well just abandon the whole project, in my opinion. But if you use the L1 as a resource, it can be very powerful. And translanguaging, look up translanguaging on the internet, if you like. It's up there now.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go.
Some Dutch schools have a policy that in the first year, when students have come from primary, some of them have had English at primary and some haven't. They have a policy that everybody can use a bit of Dutch until Christmas. And then after that, because they've had so much input, then we're going to try and change it to English. So that's another possibility.
But this idea of translanguaging that Phil's brought up, a kind of conscious movement between 2 or even 3 languages in the case of materials that you've designed, Phil. So can I just prompt you to give just an example from your materials where you've moved the student across 2 or even 3 languages and why it's happening in a learning progression, a sequence of learning?
Yes, I'm doing it very carefully now, and we're actually working a policy in the materials writing. At the moment, at the moment for the next 2 years, I'm rewriting the French materials for secondary. It's secondary CLIL in French in a certain part of the Basque Country. Okay, there's quite a few schools doing it. We're 15 kilometers from the French border, but actually French isn't widely spoken here on the Spanish side of the Basque Country, let's say. And I'm redoing the French materials, and of course I started last year with the first of what's called ESO in Spain, where 11, 12-year-olds who've just come from primary, and I was quite shocked at suddenly having to write materials where people are beginning almost at 0, A1 or A-1 almost on the scale. And it's really influencing the way I write the materials, actually, because I could depend to some extent with the English materials on people coming through primary and having a reasonable level of English when they got to secondary. I can't depend on that now, and so translanguaging is becoming very useful. I've got in the first unit, which is called J'en sais beaucoup. I know lots. In the unit, we try to get the kids to realize that they actually know a lot of French. The Spanish will tend to say croissant instead of croissant, but they will say croissant if you force them to. And there's an awful lot, of course. I mean, they're both Latinate languages. And the kids, of course, know a lot more French than they think they do. And so the unit's based on that. So just as a very simple example, I've got lots of activities. 3, where I say, okay, how do you say this? How do you say this in Basque? How do you say this in English? How do you say this in Spanish? And how do you say it in French? And I can do it on a vocabulary level, and I can do it on a sentence level. And it's great because it empowers the kids. It makes them feel that, well, French isn't so tough after all. Basque doesn't have any roots at all with French, but the other 3 do. But anyway, the difference of Basque from the other 3 is also useful. And so when it's written into the materials, when the materials are asking the kids to reflect on their own language in order to learn the target language, if you like, it can be quite powerful.
Okay. John, have you got anything to add here then in terms of the relationship between an L1 and an L2 in a CLIL classroom?
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple of things. Of course, the role of the L1 has been a problem issue in language teaching, right from the advent of communicative language teaching, where it was demonized. But it's just wrong to think that you put a foreign student in a language class and they magically think in English. Of course they don't. They'll continue thinking in their own language for many years. And I think it's wrong to demonize the use of the native language. But I think you have to use it wisely. So I agree with what Phil and Rosie have been saying. One question I was often asked on training courses is it okay if I explain a task in English and then I translate it into Spanish or French or German or whatever it is? And there I would say, no, I wouldn't do that. If you, as a matter of routine, give your instructions or give the input in English and then you translate it, or the other way around, in fact, you're training your students not to pay attention to the English because they know that they will get it in their own language anyway. So I would definitely avoid that. But an activity where, for example, you might give half the class a text on the content in English and the other half a text on the content in their own language, but there should be some factual differences in the texts So they're not just looking at one or two words or a preposition or a difference in tense, but they have to process the texts, see what the facts are, and then they compare what does text one have in English that text two in Spanish doesn't have. Then they're working with both languages in a productive sense to retrieve the meaning, the content. And I think that kind of use of language is effective. And when I'm doing my training courses, I share the golden rule. The golden rule of all training is at any given moment in the class, you do what's effective. And the reality is sometimes it is more effective to translate or to use the mother tongue. So I don't think there's a 100% rule, but in a CLIL environment, you want the students to become more fluent and more confident at retrieving information and sharing information in English. So it's got to be important that they become productive in English in a number of ways. And I would prefer translanguaging, as Phil was saying, to just basically translating, which sometimes gives students the impression that English is Spanish or French or German with different words. It's really not. It's a different system, and they have to learn to appreciate the differences in a more profound way than just by translating.
Okay.
I'm also thinking about students of ethnic minorities. So we have students here who speak Arabic at home or Turkish at home, and it's very difficult if they're then functioning in two other languages in the classroom. Although Phil, of course, you're talking about Basque and Spanish, and so maybe it's not. But I think we have to take those sort of students into consideration as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's interesting discussion taking place in the chat actually about this. About the importance of recognizing that languages are resources. One person is also talking about how when she does move between the two languages, I think it's Spanish and English, she signals by using I think it's a red glass when she's going to talk in Spanish. So that's just a nice signal for the learners to see
a flag. That
movement. Flags, yeah. Okay. I want to move to another Padlet question then. And this might go back to what Rosie was talking about in terms of cognitive demands. The question is, what about students with educational special needs? Now, what the questioner is meaning by that is not students who are deaf or blind, but those with problems in understanding. They can only study the basics of a specific subject, reaching only a 5 or 6 out of 10. 10 is the maximum mark in Spain. So this is someone also based in Spain. So I guess by understanding, the questioner is talking not just about understanding linguistically, but also cognitively. John, have you had some thoughts about this question?
Very interesting question. And it comes up quite a lot on training programs. And of course, CLIL isn't an answer for all of the problems that exist in normal classes, like behavioral issues and students who just don't want to be in school. These things don't just disappear, and special needs don't disappear either. What I would say is, in CLIL in particular, the focus on working in small groups tends to help students who need a bit more time or a bit more support. And if the whole class is working in different groups and different teams, that allows the teacher to go and circulate and to perhaps provide a bit more assistance and a bit more interpersonal assistance to the students who need it. Weaker students across the board, in my experience, tend to feel more comfortable in small groups rather than in large groups anyway, so I think that's a good thing to do. And by breaking down tasks into mini steps, I think that often adds a degree of clarity that benefits all students. I don't think that CLIL will make a student with special educational needs a brilliant student overnight. I don't think any system will, but I think it can make the process more enjoyable and it can make it seem more doable, and I think it can offer more support and more encouragement. Along the lines that I was mentioning before. So I think CLIL, it shouldn't be ruled out. In many schools, I know that the students who get to experience CLIL have been selected because they're already good at English or something. I don't think that's a model that we need to follow everywhere. So I do think that students who find school in general difficult can be included in a CLIL class very successfully.
Yeah, and Rosie, we've seen in the Netherlands that CLIL and bilingual education is offered now across all levels of Dutch secondary education. It's a selective system in the Netherlands, but it's offered across all the 3 main levels. So what's your thoughts about this particular question?
I think my thoughts about the question were to use formative assessment or portfolios and to measure a student's development rather than their achievement against the rest of the class. I don't know if that's possible to work with portfolios, or because you might have a very good student who moves a tiny bit, and you might have a student who's really struggling and moves a long way. So I think it would maybe be fairer to reward them for their development, although it's of course difficult to implement maybe, but it seems to be fairer rather than, you know, putting everybody at the same level with a test. That's
So
my idea.
You'd want to look at methods of assessment then. Of course,
Yes.
some teachers don't necessarily have the freedom to change those methods.
No, then I, yeah, if some of the students can only, what was the question? They could only have the basics, maybe only test them on the basics, so they can still get a 10 on the basics. Whereas, I don't know, difficult question, thorny question, always differentiating. But yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, Phil?
Yeah, I know a little bit about this. In Spain, these particular students are called ATHIs. It's an acronym, and they often what's great is they're not excluded. They spend most of the time in the classroom. And I've seen some very sort of sad cases of this. You know, kids sort of not excluded deliberately, but just because they can't do it, they're not expected to. But I had a sort of revelation. It was actually a couple of years ago. I was working here with a woman who was working on a document for dyslexia in the Basque Country, and the document's now finished, and it's a training document actually, and they asked me to contribute to it. And what amazed me when I read this, there were 12, I think there were 12 principles. What completely stunned me was that the 12 principles for dealing with dyslexia, I'm suggesting that these students are dyslexic, but were very, very similar to the things that you do in CLIL. So it's exactly what John was saying. What you do in CLIL, you start by trying to break down material into smaller chunks, into smaller process chunks. That's the way that you try to do it. And so it obviously benefits the student. I mean, I could go on, the recycling of material, the repetition, not just the classroom management, of course. I mean, the interaction patterns that you would obviously favor are not individual. And I've often seen cases in Spain where the students have been sort of isolated on their own. It's just bizarre. I mean, it's exactly what they shouldn't be doing. I mean, obviously you don't want to hold the other people back, but there has to be some policy whereby there's peer teaching. I mean, John Hattie's already told us and shown us that peer teaching is one of the most powerful things you can do. If you have peer teaching as well involved in that. Again, it's a question of, I think, policy and understanding, the highlighting of language, the recycling of language, etc., etc. And I can't remember all those 12 principles, but I was very, very interested in the way that it coincided with many of the things that I think, you know, a CLIL trainer or a teacher does instinctively. So yeah, very much interesting.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go for it.
I'd like to say there's one specific thing which is a key feature of Classroom CLIL, which helps all learners, is the focus on visuals, visual aids, Venn diagrams, timelines, mind maps, these kind of things, and making learning visual. Again, that's another thing that John Hattie talks about a great deal, really does help it. That studies show that it's easier to understand the basic ideas because there isn't a lot of text there, and it seems to activate the aspects of the memory better. So the focus on visuals in the CLIL classroom is, I think, something that all teachers can learn from.
That was one of the 12, John. Sorry, thank you for that. Yeah. Yes, and it's an obvious point, isn't it? You know, if a dyslexic has problems with those figures, the shapes, the larger visuals and certain graphic organizers obviously can help. Yes, you're absolutely right.
So that's something that teachers might consider in terms of their own materials design and materials that they design for their lessons. I mean, I think some of those other principles, Phil, that you're talking about might also to do with how text is presented to students. So breaking text down, making sure you have a larger font size, using subtitles, having plenty of white space. So it's about what's also known as easification, not simplifying the text, but making it easier in terms of its readability.
That's right. Yeah, it's called top-down processing in a lot of ways, and the way that a student just, you know, when you give a student a long dense text and you can just about read the title, you know, they go, read that for homework. You know, can you imagine one of these poor students being given that to do? You know, but if you've broken it up into paragraphs, you put a nice large title, you put subtitles in the paragraphs, you've used bold font, etc., underlined stuff. It's not rocket science as they say, but you know, those are all, as I say, they all came up in those principles that I read.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I hope the person who asked that question has found some useful responses from our panelists. I want to then go to John and ask you to tell us your question. I think, Phil, are you still there? You froze for a moment.
Yeah.
Yes, you are still there. Great, it's good. John, what's your question for the
Okay, so my question is based on my early experience where I found in lots of CLIL training courses, I was teaching teachers of English. So my question is, what can teachers of English learn from CLIL?
Do you want to answer that question first, or do you want someone else to go first?
I'd be happy to pass that to my fellow panelists. Have a think.
So, Rosie, can I start with you?
Yes, I think it's a hard question because it's not the idea that EFL teachers are going to suddenly start teaching biology or history, things like that. And I think there's a role of English teachers, particularly in secondary, to collaborate. So I think they can learn to collaborate with subject teachers, and they can bring more authentic materials into the classroom. I think they do that already. I always say that CLIL is really a sort of a mix of good active teaching and good EFL. So, but on the other hand, there was a study by Sasa in Japan, who, I don't know how to say his name, Shigeru Sasayama, and he did a study at Japanese universities where the English teachers were teaching quite conservatively, and he tried to bring CLIL methodology, a bit like what you're doing at the university in Italy, in health sciences. So they brought more input related to health sciences in, and he tried to make it more interactive. So I think in that way, some EFL teachers have something to learn from CLIL methodology. And depends on the teacher.
Okay, and you're focusing there, Rosie, on the idea of making the language lessons more interactive.
Yes, I think it was very much a transmission model, and the Japanese teachers were transmitting grammar, and I think that the experiment was to teach them more CLIL methodology and help the students to interact with material, with each other at a university level in order to help them to learn the health sciences better.
Yeah, okay.
In English.
Yeah. Phil?
I like this question, and I think I know why John asked it. Yeah, I like this question, and can I just a quick preamble on this question. When CLIL began as an acronym, or whenever the parameters began in 1995, what tended to happen was that desperately subject teachers and CLIL trainers like me back then had to depend on and go back to English language or language teaching methodology. There was nowhere else to go. If you look at the history of CLIL itself and publications, the first book that came out in about 2005 was OUP. It was Teaching Subjects to Other Languages. Yeah. And the book's okay, but it borrows wholly from English language methodology, and it goes, I think it goes a little bit too far, you know, but it kind of worked. And when Rosie and Liz Dale wrote CLIL Skills, they did the same. And I'm not saying that it went too far. It's a great book, but obviously they had to borrow from and Rosie's been talking about, they had to borrow from, there it is. Yeah. From, sorry, CLIL Activity. No, the CLIL Skills one. Before. Yeah. It was the first book I read where somebody, yeah, that's it. Where you 10% commission for this, right? It was the first time I saw when somebody actually had realized, you know, that there was, you could borrow from English language stuff, but not wholly. To get on to the point, what can language teachers learn? Well, they can learn an awful lot. And one of the big problems in CLIL is that language teachers should not, and perhaps do not now, assume that they understand what CLIL is about, because it's a very different thing. I think that language teachers need to understand how content behaves, okay? How content behaves, because content teachers need to understand how language behaves in their subject. So it's really the opposite. How does content behave? And if a language teacher goes to watch a subject teacher teaching, it doesn't have to be in the target language. They'll be quite surprised at how different a physics class or a chemistry class or a geography class is from their class. I'm not saying it's better or worse. So the shape of a content class is very different from a language class. A very simple example is that Boas said there were 3 moves in any class, in any educational event, in any class, the 3 moves. And he called it orientation, complication, resolution. Jason, sitting there, came up with a wonderful allegory, which was starter, main course, and dessert. Okay, it's a nice idea, but there are 3 moves in the classroom. And if you watch language teachers teaching, they're very, very good at the starters. In fact, the starters sometimes go on for the whole class, you know? But they're very, very bad at desserts. They're not very good at desserts. They often say, "Oh, finish for homework." Whereas if you go to watch a subject teacher, you'll see quite the opposite. Subject teachers aren't trained so well in starters, but they're very, very good at the resolution, the ending of a class. They'll always stop 10 minutes before. Why? Because they're aware that they have to resolve the content. Language teachers don't resolve content, because how can you resolve the content when you've just been, well, today we're going to concentrate on listening. Or what have you got to resolve? There's nothing to resolve. And so it's not a criticism, it's just a reality. So if language teachers want to understand and get things from CLIL, first of all, go and observe subject teachers and make notes and see how you can then start to support subject teachers, because the structures are very different.
Okay, and Phil, I'll just stick with you very quickly, because there's a question that's come up in the chat. How much of an expert do you have to be on the subject? I'm a language teacher who must teach bacteriology, nursing, and advertising at college. It's quite demanding. So maybe your suggestion there would be relevant for this questioner, to go and watch some subject teachers and to think about those 3 moves in the lesson, particularly the sort of main course and dessert phase, and to think about the shape of their lesson then, perhaps.
I'm just looking at Juan Sanchez. Yeah, Juan talking about. I mean, if I was you, Juan, I would immediately think about, as Jason says, about that main course phase, that main part of the class, where what you need to be doing, if you don't feel too confident about the content, if you're really in this situation, if you don't feel too confident about the content, then you would want to be, facilitating as much as possible. You would want the students to be working as much as possible. You might not even be trying to pretend that you're an expert. You're trying to get the students working themselves. I mean, you've obviously prepared the lesson, and you've prepared it as well as you can, and you've looked up the content as well as possible. You're in a difficult position, but yeah, you wouldn't want to be standing at the front transmitting. We're going back to the early part of this presentation now, transmitting and trying to pass yourself off as an expert. There's no way you would want to be doing that. But yeah, certainly you would want to think about those 3 moves, and perhaps how you could present yourself as a reasonable teacher in that resolution phase at the end. Okay, we've done this. Let's just you can even ask the students to resolve for you, can't you? Give us 3 things that we've learned from this lesson. I'm kind of cheating slightly here, but that's a tricky situation you're in. I think that often when you move into secondary, you'll often tend to find that language teachers are teaching what's called, if they're teaching soft CLIL, I write those materials, it's using content, and it's using content objectives, but it's not taking the language teachers too far from their content expertise. But that's one suggestion, for example.
Okay, thanks, Phil. I'm conscious we've got 10 minutes left, and there's been some questions in the chat about assessment. Now, this is something that we could talk about for another hour. One of the questions is, any tips for assessment? And there's also another question about, is it more, and this is one that comes up, I'm sure you've all had this question in training, do you have to, what's more important, assessing the content, or the question is put, writing correctly in the second language? Can we deal with these questions about assessment in, let's say, 3 minutes? Let's start with you, Rosie.
Yeah, a Dutch teacher asked me this as well. I think it's also it's connected with making aims. If you have aims for the lesson, I'm trying to get teachers to think about what is the language aim, and it can just be 10 pieces of vocabulary, but it could also be giving an opinion on something. So if you're, then maybe you can also partly assess the English. If students aren't rewarded for doing something in English, then they're not going to make such an effort. So I think if you've got language aims and content aims, and of course, if you're a biology teacher, the biology is much more important than the English, then I think it's fair to say, I'm going to expect you to be able to give an opinion and use these 10 pieces of vocabulary in the test.
Okay.
So that's one thing. And again, progress in language, using more formative assessment, checking out where people are, getting them to self-assess. But I think if you don't reward the work in English, then students don't make such an effort.
Yeah, and that notion of reward,
But
Rosie, it links back to what John was talking about in terms of motivation.
Yes.
But there's a clear tip there that you're giving as well, to the emphasis on formative assessments.
Yes,
checking progress, giving feedback regularly as well. That John mentioned that.
Yes, and I think that's happened more during COVID-19, that teachers have been able to give more individual feedback. I heard a teacher who totally moved into formative and assessment, and he said, I'm going to have to go back now and give my students tests, and I don't want to. So it was interesting. He had more contact online personally with each student and where they were during the epidemic when he was teaching online.
Okay. So that's a nice example of how online learning has actually been beneficial.
For somebody, yeah.
John, any quick tips on assessment?
When I talk to content teachers, I've never once heard of a content teacher who said about a piece of writing in an exam or in class, that was a fantastic history essay with wonderful use of prepositions, for example.
Yeah.
It's got to be the focus on the key points of the content as clearly as possible. And I think that there's an increasing amount of work being done now on the discourse. What is the discourse type for the history lesson or the chemistry experiment that is going to be most effective most quickly? Clearly, if the English is so confusing that you don't know what's being said or done, it doesn't help anyone. But the focus has got to be on the content being clearly and accurately portrayed.
Yeah, and in Rosie's book, CLIL Activities, there's a whole really brilliant section there about the language of different subjects, so that idea of, the discourse of the subject. I mean, that's a bit of that book that I constantly revisit, those pages about the language of different subjects.
And of course, if you're working at a high level, and then you need the language. So inevitably you get a worse mark if you don't achieve the cognitive level in the assessment, in the assignment. So it's linked together, interwoven.
Yeah. Phil, I want you to pose your question in a moment, but have you also got some tips for assessment that you want to quickly share with us?
Very quickly, I've written about this, and I go back to where Rosie started on objectives, on aims. And again, what John said, a subject teacher is not going to write out an objective beginning with a linguistic objective, but you can write objectives in 3 dimensions. You can write them with a conceptual aim, a procedural aim, and a linguistic aim. You can say, do this by using this language. You can. I think that just to slightly nuance what John said, I think that you can pick out certain aspects of the discourse that you might expect to see, and you'd write that in the objective. You don't want to go too far. Obviously, that's what John means. You can't go on and on, right down to prepositional level. But you might say, I'm expecting to see this language. I'm expecting to see these words. If we talk about photosynthesis, we need these process words, this kind of vocabulary and grammar. And so you can include that. You can say at the end of the objective, using the appropriate academic language. And if the students know what that is, then that's part of the mark. That's part of the summative assessment. So I think that language can come in, but you can't lead with that. As John says, the subject teacher is trying to teach, in this case, photosynthesis. Biology teacher is not primarily interested in the language, but the language has to be there in order for the student to answer satisfactorily, as Rosie says.
Okay. Phil, can you pose your question?
Yeah, I forgot what it is now. Yes. I'm interested in knowing what John and Rosie think about where CLIL's kind of going, because we still kind of talk about CLIL as a new thing, but it started in 1995. We're talking about 25 years now. And you know, Elastic seems to be more in the public arena, but it's I think CLIL has undergone certain changes during its career so far. So where do John and Rosie think it's going, let's say, in the next decade? What's going to happen?
Can I just add to that, because we had a question in the chat, which is, do you think CLIL is here to stay? So can we add that into the mix as well, please? John, can we go with you first?
I do think CLIL is here to stay, in the same way that communicative teaching, which started in the mid-70s, that's here to stay. However, in the same way that we still haven't really figured out what communicative teaching is, and it's a broad umbrella term, CLIL is still a huge umbrella term. So I think what will happen over the next decade is we'll get a refined understanding of what CLIL is, or what the different sorts of CLIL are. What I hope for the teachers is that we get more materials for the different areas at the different levels, so that CLIL teachers don't have to be materials writers as well, which is a different set of skills, and it's hugely time consuming for classroom teachers to create CLIL materials. So I hope that that changes. But I think that CLIL and EFL will come together a little bit more. I think that the English classrooms will hopefully take on board lessons from CLIL, such as having more focus on concepts, so using language to do something. I think what CLIL and EFL will share will be a more project-based approach, so displaying language by getting things done, creating things, having outcomes, having performances, having products. So focusing on the kind of skills which are also incidentally the skills that the workplace is increasingly turning towards. So a bigger focus on problem solving, which I guess means less teacher-fronted teaching, which still exists in CLIL and also still exists in language classrooms. So I think we'll move towards more projects. And I think the experience that we've had since February, March, where everyone has been online, opens lots of possibilities. I can imagine a time in the future where instead of having pen pals corresponding in English, there could be chemistry classes between Osaka and Buenos Aires and Paris, where the kids of the same age are actually working together across the syllabus with very practical things. That could be very interesting, that kind of genuine internationalized learning.
Okay, thanks, John. Rosie, the future of CLIL in under a minute.
Yes, I think more CLIL materials, and I hope that management will invest more in professionalising CLIL teachers. I think there'll be more training. There'll probably more universities will offer more official training. And I also thought about the online. I think there'll be more online collaboration between teachers, between learners, training online with video, and yeah.
Okay, thanks, Rosie. Phil, have you got anything to add to that? So lots of ideas there in terms of the future of CLIL. We've got less than a minute now.
Yeah, no, I had great suggestions. I just meant that Do Coyle once said, she said, the acronym CLIL will exist when people don't need it anymore. And she said, it's going to be a good sign when it goes. And it more or less what John and Rosie said there was, you know, if people are working on educational approaches which are focused on the impact of language on learning, then we won't need to talk about CLIL as an acronym anymore. People will just be doing it. Okay,
that's a nice way to finish off. I think I'm going to bring the discussion to an end. We're just before 5 o'clock UK time. Thank you, panelists. I'm going to share my screen. I hope I can do this quickly. And just to say to the audience that have been watching this discussion, I hope you found that useful. I certainly found it very interesting. We covered lots of ground there in terms of looking at this idea of teaching subject content through English. There was a focus, of course, on CLIL. If you're interested in doing some training with NILE, we do have a CLIL online course. John and Phil are tutors on that course. We've also now got an EMI course as well. So please go to the website and have a look at the CLIL courses and the EMI course as well. You can get 25% off apparently at the moment. So there's a code there that you can use. You should also, of course, check out Rosie Tanner's website as well, rosietanner.com. Find out more about the training that Rosie provides. Thank you everyone for attending. Just to remind you as well to download your certificate. It should appear in the chat at some point. I think a NILE colleague is going to be uploading it there. And of course, if you want to go to the membership area and become a NILE member, you can then access the recording of this session. Any more information about NILE, you've got an email address there on the screen. Please get in touch with us. So thank you, panelists, again. Thank you very much for that very interesting and rewarding discussion. So thank you for coming along.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for asking, Jason. Yeah.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.